Yeah, 50 years later, the Buffalo Springfield. I've only said that like 300 times, and I miss it today. Yeah, 50 years later, the Buffalo Springfield still have it right. Something is happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. And Retake Our Democracy in its blog and in this show tries to shed light on what's happening and what you can do about it. So good morning. You are listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today we will be speaking with Sireesh Manne, the executive director of the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. And we'll get to Sireesh in just a minute, but first I need to make a few announcements. I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this interview on stolen Tewa land and thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. Last week, we had a very important conversation with three of the leaders of the Tribal Education Alliance of New Mexico, Jasmine Yepa from the Jemez Pueblo, and a policy analyst, Native American Budget and Policy Institute. And she's also a coordinator of the Tribal Education Alliance, a coalition of tribal education leaders, experts, and advocates. Also on that show was Conroy Chino. And Conroy is from the Acoma Pueblo and had a long career in both investigative journalism and in filmmaking. He also was the Secretary of, what was it? I think it was of Labor for the Richardson administration and serves as a lobbyist for the Tribal Education Alliance. Lastly, we also had Representative Derek Lenti, who is currently chair of the House Agricultural and Water Resources Committee and vice chair of the Water and Natural Resources Committee. So if you missed the broadcast or if you are driving around today and don't catch all of the conversation we're about to have, you can watch today's show and all of our past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, hovering over the actions and events page and clicking on Retake Conversations. And today's discussion with Sireesh will be posted on Saturday, usually right at 9 o'clock. I want to remind you that Retake has 2021 legislative strategy, and part of that is 15 transformational bills and 28 priority bills for which we are advocating. And we have started the advocacy work the day after the general election, so we've been hard at it. Our strategy is to use December and early January to organize constituent teams in which we will organize teams in 27 democratically controlled Senate districts. It's our observation that for the last several sessions, when a good bill died, it died in the Senate. And so we're really focusing there. Most of our bills passed through the House and then died in the Senate. And so we're organizing constituent Zoom conversations with those senators. If you want to be a part of that, you can go to retakeourdemocracy.org and just go to the homepage and there's a button right on the homepage for signing up. And if you just tell us what Senate district you're in, and there's a link to help you with that on the form that you fill out, then we'll get back to you and get you into that Zoom team. We also want to find out in December, and you've only got 5 more days, where your opinions on our bills. And so we've published another version. We did a survey of our 2017 bills. And based on that, we got responses from about 1,500 people statewide. And we organized for the 2019 legislative session. Well, this time we've got our 15 bills listed in the survey. It only takes 5 or 10 minutes to complete. And we're going to disaggregate all that data by Senate district and share it with Senate leadership and all the senators. So if you want to get involved in that and raise your voice, please. It just takes 5 or 10 minutes. And the button for you to do that is also on the homepage at retakeourdemocracy.org. So that's about all we have to share with you today. So we're going to get started with Sireesh. Let's get started. Welcome, Sireesh.
Thank you.
Good. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So would you tell us just a bit about your background and how you wound up at the Center for New Mexico Center for Law and Poverty, on Law and Poverty?
Sure. Well, let me first thank you, Paul, for having me, and to everybody who's joining us. I also want to applaud you on your work for really growing Retake Our Democracy and elevating all these issues that are so important to all of us. A little bit of background on me. I was raised in New Mexico. I was raised in an immigrant family, really blessed to have parents that held on tightly to their culture. So I was raised around a lot of culture, and also had the ability to travel back to their home in India. So I spent, parts of my childhood in a small village across the world, which was obviously very different than life here. And I remember that in school. Like, I remember growing up and feeling both the promise of where we live, but also really different, as a darker skinned woman. And it meant a lot of challenges, I think, along the way, later on in high school. And it really wasn't until later, I think, when I ended up meeting other women of color and women of color who were doing community organizing, that I started to really be able to articulate my experiences, and to be able to really articulate things like racism, or be able to see the common experiences that women face, or that we face as immigrants, while also realizing that there's so much I can't comprehend, right? And so many experiences that people have had that I will never be able to, fully understand. I'd also been working these jobs while I was trying to get through college. Worked, at a kitchen of a restaurant as a front desk receptionist. I worked in a facility for young people who were coming out of detention, a residential facility, and then ended up getting really involved in youth issues, and working with a nonprofit, and co-led a nonprofit that helped young people learn how to organize. And through all of this, I began to really, just fundamentally start understanding that things like law and policy were so important to our lives. I wanted to do something to better our community, put myself in service to the community. And law and policy seemed really important, and yet I knew so little about it. So many of us are excluded from it, and I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to learn more about it. So I went to school, and after graduating, went looking for social justice organizations, looking for those organizations that were bridging community work with legal work. And it led me to New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. And at the time, it was a small organization. That was 12 years ago. It was being built by Kim Posich and Gail Evans. It was 4 attorneys, I think. Now we've grown to, over 10 attorneys. We have about 12 attorneys, and both of them left this really incredible legacy. And we work on so many of the issues that are really important to New Mexico. When I took on the executive director position about 3 years ago, we were inheriting a lot of work, a lot of big work, and we've since been building a really dedicated and really just exceptional team of staff working on all of this advocacy. And it's a real honor. It's an honor to do this work, and it's an honor to be doing it on behalf of our communities.
Yeah, there are a few nonprofits in New Mexico where I know Retake really looks to for just excellence in capacity and values, and you're one of them. New Mexico Voices for Children, another, and Environmental Law Center also. It's just it's so important to have those kinds of organizations in a state like New Mexico, because the disparities are so great, the inequity is so great, that if you don't have not just people who are committed, but people who are also capable, who really, get the job done. So thank you for your work. Before we get into the substance of my questions about what the center does, I just thought I'd ask you why the Center on Law and Poverty does the work that it does. I mean, what's the impetus for that?
Well, we I mean, in New Mexico, we live in such an amazing community. It's a really vibrant community, a really diverse community, and amazing families. And yet we deal with some of the biggest inequities and longstanding poverty that affects the well-being of everyone. Um, I think at New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, we recognize that poverty is economic injustice. We recognize that it's because of an unfair distribution of resources, because of racism, systemic racism, racial inequity that really should have no place in our society, and yet has continued on historically and into the present day, happens routinely, systemically. And so to dismantle this, to dismantle the kind of an economic inequity that we face, to really tackle the issues, our response has to be system-wide, and it has to be across systems, it has to be multifaceted. And so the areas in which we work in are multifaceted, in that we work with communities to identify priorities. It's really important to us to work on the issues that are most important to our families and the people who are impacted by laws and policies every day in this way. We also do litigation. So we work on representing people in systemic cases and impact litigation in the courts. We also do policy advocacy. So with the legislature, going and doing work with our lawmakers, but also with public institutions and agencies, like critical agencies that deliver food programs, or our schools or hospitals. And then finally, we do community work, which is work like dialogue with our communities, know your rights work, and advocacy to work with our communities to make changes, to enforce those changes, and to make sure that those are long lasting.
I was remembering, I worked with one of the lawyers, I don't think he's still there, Abuku Estrada, and he did a presentation in Albuquerque that just blew me away. This was several years ago. And so I've followed your website, but haven't had any conversation so far with you. So it's good to speak with you today. So let's start with the Yazzie Martinez case. Can you begin by just telling us what the suit came, how the suit came about, and what the state must now do to comply with the decision? And Yahoo for getting it.
Sure, we can definitely talk about the Yazzie case, and I'll say we could spend hours talking about the Yazzie case. There's so much to it, right? In a nutshell, I'd say that the Yazzie lawsuit is really, it's all about our public education system, where for decades, our state has starved our public schools of resources. And that led to a landmark ruling in 2018 that found that the state is not providing a sufficient education and must provide a sufficient education to our students under the state constitution. Mm-hmm. And here we are 2 years later, we still don't have a sufficient education. And we also have a pandemic now, where 9 months into the pandemic, we also have students who don't have basics like technology or internet access. And so we continue to be back in court, unfortunately, but that's the reality. We're back in court and recently filed a motion about the technology issues. To give you some history about how we got to now, I'd say that the effort was really fundamentally born out of the recognition that our children are strong. Our children come with a diversity that's really incredible, a diversity of languages, of cultures, of heritages, all things that should be considered assets. And assets in the school system. And all of our children deserve to graduate ready for college, ready to pursue their dreams. And yet our school system has so many deficiencies in it and inequities. And yet this is such a fundamental thing to all of us. And education is so fundamental in New Mexico that it's enshrined in our state constitution, where our state constitution says that our education system has to be two things. One is that it has to be uniform, so it has to be equitable and provide opportunities no matter where folks are, and it has to be sufficient. So it has to provide a baseline of adequacy to all of our students, and that's in our constitution. But not only are our schools insufficient, but they're also inequitable, and that's resulting in particular disadvantages. So at the heart of the lawsuit were really 4 student groups who are facing the deepest inequities, and this includes Native American students, where our school system, reality is that it's historically been built around assimilation principles, systemic racism in the past that continues to affect the education that we provide today. Another group is English language learners, so folks who speak a language other than English at home,
Right.
where if our school system is emphasizing mostly English only instruction, students can't succeed in that kind of environment, and that's borne out where performance is so much lower for English language learners when it should be a real asset and is such a gift, right, to be able to speak two languages. Students with disabilities as well, where schools are not supporting our students with disabilities if it's not providing an appropriate learning environment, or at worst case scenario, if schools are using punitive discipline and issues when behavioral issues come up that forces kids out of our school. And then lastly, for students who grow up in low-income neighborhoods, that the education system right now is really putting low-income students at a disadvantage too, if it doesn't offer the kinds of education and programs that, frankly, higher income families are buying for their children and ought to be offered in the public school system. And this is not a small percentage of students. Like, this represents actually 80% of our students. It's the majority here. And despite that, and despite all these problems with our education system, very little has been done to fix it. And there was very little action happening at the legislature, including resistance to putting more funds into the school system. And that's what led to the litigation. And it was brought about, I'd say, 5 years ago, where Center on Law and Poverty represented 5 families, and 6 school districts also came in to cooperate on the case. It was consolidated at a later time with a similar case, which is called the Martinez case, brought by Mexican American Legal Defense Fund by MALDEF. And we went to trial after years of building out the case, of discovery, millions of documents, dozens of experts, lots of testimony. And finally, in 2018, this all resulted in the court ruling, which was a landmark ruling for the state, finding that the state had violated the Constitution and the rights of our children to a sufficient education. That ruling is quite comprehensive. There was about 600 pages of findings of fact and conclusions of law that came with it, just around all the different ways that the public education system has been insufficient. And it just touches on every aspect of the system. Sometimes we hear people say, well, this case is all about money, and it has been about money in other states, and that's part of it for New Mexico. But it's not just about money. It's also, about the how. It's about the how education is provided. And that's critical, because we're not providing programs across the board that are necessary, not providing basic things like instructional materials, and our own laws in New Mexico that define what sufficiency is, like the Indian Education Act or the Hispanic Education Act or the Bilingual Multicultural Education Act, all say what our system has to have. And yet routinely, this is not happening around a multicultural and linguistically and culturally responsive curriculum, for example. This is, not to say that funding isn't important, like funding is critical. And to be able to do all these things that we need for our system, we have to have the funds for it. And the judge found that too. The judge, ordered that the state needs to adequately resource our system, and even said that not having funds, because this is what we always hear, right? The legislature or others will say, well, we don't have enough money, so therefore we can't fund our public education system better. And the judge said that this is really not an excuse. It's not an excuse to say that you don't have the money. That's not you can't violate the constitutional rights of our students and use that as an excuse for it. And then, the ruling even pointed to all these revenue sources that were possible ways to find the money, and didn't say which way, but there's all these different ways to do it. But overall, the schools need the funding. We need funding for the students who are at the heart of the case, and bottom line, to fix equity issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to look at the report that New Mexico Voices just published yesterday, but it was powerful stuff and complete. I mean, it's one thing to talk about numbers and budgets and revenue sources, but the way they cast that on in the context of systemic racism and inequity in New Mexico was just staggeringly well done. It was one of the better pieces I've seen in a long, long time.
That's wonderful. And we've worked with New Mexico Voices for Children for a long time on the issues, and it's absolutely true. Like, all of these issues around the programs, the education system fundamentally come down to equity issues.
Right,
It's the tax
right.
system, the taxes, that's all about equity too, and where we as a community decide to spend our resources.
Well, one of the things I've written about extensively in the blog that we do is how a budget is a moral document. And it tells you exactly where you stand in terms of where you're bringing money from and how you're spending that money. And I thought that Voices did a tremendous job of really putting that in a context and with a lens that hopefully embarrasses the legislature and goads them to action. I need to remind our listeners that it is in times like these that KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news and great entertainment, things to keep you occupied while you're holed up at home. And so for those of you who can afford it, please consider making a contribution. All you have to do is go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, send them 10, 20, 50 bucks and look at it as your ticket for admission to a whole lot of great programming. So try and do that. And today I'm speaking with Sireesh Manne, the executive director of the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. And we're just getting started in the conversation. And she just outlined some of the major elements of the Yazzie case. And you actually went beyond bringing the suit. You then created a set of guidelines for the state on how they could address the findings and the court order. And to what degree has the state implemented it? And what are some of the elements of those guidelines?
Well, after the court ruling in 2018, the big question then became, what do we need to do, right? We know that the system is insufficient. We know it's not equitable. And what is it going to take? What's it really going to take to fix our school system? So the Center on Law and Poverty in 2018 gathered hundreds of people. This was our legal team, including Gail Evans, Preston Sanchez, Lauren Winkler, and others, working with lots of people in our community to flesh out a plan. And it was young people, parents, educators, tribal leaders, school districts, all coming together in a really, I'd say, unprecedented way to figure out what it is that we need, and looking at all this evidence that had come out from the court ruling as well about what needed to happen. And it was clear that we needed transformative changes, clear that we needed comprehensive changes. And out of this work, we created a platform together, a platform of remedies that has now, and we also built a coalition together that came out of this work, and that's the Transform Education New Mexico Coalition, which you can actually get online and read more about the platform. It's like a 30-page document, and that's www.transformedutionnm.org. But the platform, includes a lot of different elements. It includes having at the core a multicultural and multilingual framework for education. These are all parts of the court ruling as well, that we need to have culturally and linguistically responsive curriculum, bilingual programs in every grade, starting from pre-K onwards, that we need teachers. We need to fix the shortages of teachers in our schools, and we have to start supporting them as professionals and supporting them as the professionals that they are. And have a diversity of teachers where, we have a situation now where we have most of our kids are students of color and most of our teachers are not. Like 11% of our students are Native, for example, and only 2% of our teachers are Native American. So what do we do to diversify, the workforce? We also need programs like early childhood and pre-K. Like these were all proven to be successful and things that we know work, and yet they're not being provided across the state and not being accessible to everybody. So early childhood programs, extended learning, summer school, special education programs, reading programs, the whole, spectrum of things, access to technology, access to internet, access to basic materials and transportation. In addition, health and wellness programs for our kids, and many more issues. This is just an overview of what all is in that platform. Mm-hmm. And then funding, of course, is it's important. It's important to fund the system and specifically, fund it in a way that's equitable. Our state, since the ruling, really focused on a few areas at the legislature mostly, and this was focusing on pre-K and the K-5 Plus program, which is a summer school program. And they also focused on funding the at-risk index, our funding formula for students. And this was, more funding than the schools had gotten in the past, but unfortunately, it really wasn't enough to fix the system. Where the funding, even the 400 million that was put into the schools, last year, just returned our schools, was actually just started beginning returning our schools to what it was pre-2008, before the recession. So at a time, over 12 years ago, when funding wasn't even sufficient, that's where we're just getting our system back to right now,
And now
when you account
COVID.
for inflation.
And now COVID, yeah.
Right, and now COVID, and then suddenly there's this huge setback in funding as well, and this budget crisis that we're facing, as well, and the education system too. But it's also a real opportunity, to work on the things that have been broken and to really completely transform the way in which education is done. And what we've been really asking for from the state is have that plan together, put together that comprehensive plan. You have models in front of you. You have the platform that we've put in front of you. All the tribal leaders have also gotten together and put together a tribal remedy framework that's also available.
Right, we talked about that last week.
Yeah, and so that framework is an important platform as well. And these are things that the public education department can take as a starting place, but we need to be able to get to a place of saying, here are the things we have to do. We have to sequence it. We have to put action steps in, and we have to understand how much it's going to cost so that we can actually put the resources in to make this happen.
Yeah. It's interesting you're doing that, because before I retired and moved to Santa Fe in the Bay Area, I had a consulting firm for almost 30 years, and it was public health and it was K-12 and early childhood. And I can't tell you, you'd go to these, I worked with school districts and with the state, and you'd go to those school districts and they were so overextended just in their capacity to just to keep the parts moving, that they never had time to step outside the box and think about what they were doing. Like, does this make sense? And so our consulting firm would do the research on best practices and come to them and say, well, this would be a better way to do this bilingual education or this early childhood education program. And it was remarkable that they just didn't have the capacity, and often didn't have any awareness that there were these kinds of alternative ways of doing business. It was shocking. We've only got about another minute before the end of the radio show. And so I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to tell people where they can get more information about our discussion, and assure our listeners that we will continue the discussion on the podcast. Sireesh?
Sure. Well, thank you again. So the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, like I said, we work across a broad spectrum of issues: healthcare for all, public education system, workers' rights issues, wage theft, and then economic relief and public benefits programs. To find out more information about us, you can come onto our website, which is www.nmpovertylaw.org. And there's information there. We're also on social media, so you can see us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We have a YouTube channel, so find us on social media as well.
Okay, well, thank you for for your time, and as I mentioned, we'll continue this discussion on the podcast. I do want to let our listeners know it's December. We're recording this a week early, actually, but the show is airing on the 26th, and this is the last show of our 2020 year, and we've been on the air for 4 years. But we've never had a year like this. And so I want to encourage all of you to kind of take some time over the next few days to think about this year and think about next year. We've got a lot to do, and we've got a lot to learn. And but the one thing that I would say is most important is you need to stay engaged, and you need to stay informed, and you need to stay active, because that's the only way we're going to fix this. So we'll be back next year. Take care. Okay, we're back. And now we can be loosey-goosey. Another of your priorities is healthcare. How does the center advance healthcare equity? And do you have any health care legislation you'll be supporting in 2021? And I assume the Health Security Act will be one of those, but are there other bills that you're taking a look at?
Yeah, so at Center on Law Poverty, we do both legal work, but we also do a fair amount of policy work, including legislative work. And this is important. And I'll just say, frankly, there's lots of lobbyists in New Mexico who work with big special interests, but there's not that many who work for the people. Who's really representing the interests of people. So it's important that advocacy groups, it's important that community groups really start working at the legislature and work with policymakers on developing laws and crafting those policies, which is the kind of work we do of serving as experts for policymakers and doing that. And this year, we're really excited about the legislature because of some of the changes in the legislature. It opens up the path to do some things that have not been done before and that we can get done now. And it's an opportunity to really pursue a bold vision where the year has shown us that we really can't wait any longer. It's a priority, and it's a priority to start getting things like healthcare for everybody. And yes, we are working on affordable care for everyone. A lot more people right now, because of the ACA, have coverage, but healthcare is still unaffordable for a lot of people. And we see the reality that just thousands of people are getting sued for hospital bills, being put into medical debt. We've taken on some of those cases. And especially now, it's really vital during a pandemic that everybody has access to healthcare. And for years, the state has been talking about expanding healthcare to everyone, and we think now is the time to do it. We have an opportunity to do it now too because of funding. There's actually an opportunity to raise some revenues through a health insurance tax that recently expired at the federal level that can be done at the state level, which raises over $100 million. And if put back into healthcare, it would work to reduce costs for everybody and reduce costs of healthcare. And so that's something that we are supporting and have been working on pretty closely for a long time now over the year. And there are two immediate ways that those funds could be used to reduce healthcare costs. And one of them is by helping people buy coverage. So helping people get insurance if they're not eligible for Medicaid, because right now, as you know, people have insurance, but super costly. The deductibles are really high. People are still going into debt over just their deductibles. And the second one is to expand coverage for those who don't have anything at all right now, including our lowest wage workers who are essential to the economy and you get stuck out of the system because of things like immigration status or because their employer doesn't actually provide affordable coverage. So it's important that tens of thousands of people who are just locked out of coverage altogether have coverage too. So we are supporting and continue to support with Strong Families New Mexico and a number of community groups the Medicaid buy-in plan, which is an option that would essentially, right now in the immediate future, open up Medicaid for anyone, or not for anyone. In the immediate, immediately it would open up Medicaid to people who can't get coverage right now on the ACA, with the hope that in the future that it could be opened up to just anyone to be able to buy, kind of like a public option for our state. Right. And this is based off of a public plan. You mentioned Health Security Act, which is a similar concept, but does it through a nonprofit plan where insurance is then wrapped up into a nonprofit. And both of them are both, they're getting to the same thing through different ways, right? So whether it's a public plan that we open up or a nonprofit plan that's opened up, both of these things need to be, studied in terms of the details of implementation. And we hope that we will see this in New Mexico in the future, because our state can lead the way. We can innovate on these things. For this year, we're focusing on those foundational steps. We're focusing on getting the coverage for everyone, getting the funding source in place.
Right. Well, the Health Security Act in the best case scenario would be 3 years down the road. So the Medicare buy-in is Medicaid buy-in is critical as a bridge to that at the very worst, or at the very best, whichever. I know you are also deeply involved in worker rights and wage theft, and it's certainly one of the areas in which you've been involved in a number of ways. Do you work with Somos? Because this is, we're in Santa Fe, and Marcella's kind of a pal. So we've worked with Somos on this issue, and I assume maybe you do as well. But how do you work on issues of worker justice?
So we do work with Somos and have been working with Somos, excellent organization, and others too, workers' rights organizations across the state, including OLE. El Centro, which is in Albuquerque, Cafe, which is down in southern New Mexico, Center for Civic Policy, and others who've all actually been working together as a collaborative on wage issues and workers issues over several years. And one of the big issues that has come up is this issue of wage theft, where people are not being paid minimum wage. And we've been, had to sue businesses that have not been paying wages correctly or violations of minimum wage laws. And we also sued the state and Department of Workforce Solutions for not enforcing the wage laws. For New Mexico, we have some of the toughest wage laws in the whole country, and yet these were not being enforced. And this is prior to the current governor's administration too, where claims say if you had a claim for over $10,000 for some unexplainable reason, the department wasn't enforcing those higher dollar claims, or just making it really difficult to get through the process or closing cases without investigating them. So that's changed now because we've had the lawsuit and enforcement now and we've been working with the department to, figure out its manuals for workers and all these kinds of things. But we still have a backlog of cases. And this again was inherited by the current governor. And we still have 1,600 open cases right now of wage claims that have not been investigated or enforced. So we need resources. Department of Workforce Solutions needs more workers to be able to enforce these claims, and that takes funding and hiring some more people. So that's going to be important in this upcoming legislative session is, can we get more workers for DWS? Another big issue that's come up for workers groups and really spearheaded by Olay and El Centro and others is paid sick leave, and ensuring that every worker across the state has the opportunity to get paid sick leave. If you're sick, you should be staying home. And especially now during this public health emergency where it's so critical to all of us, like you don't want people going into work if they've, have COVID or were exposed. And you simply just shouldn't have to be forced to go to work or risk getting fired. But that's the reality for too many working people, where hardworking families, shouldn't have to be figuring out how to make rent right now. And yet almost half of New Mexico's workers don't have sick leave. And 90% of them are low income workers who are making less than $15,000 a year. So it's important to have legislation, and it's important to do it statewide, where the legislation that's going to be proposed is to require all employers to provide paid sick leave. For every hour or every 30 hours that an employee works, this would require 1 hour of sick leave, and up to about 1 week per year, so 56 hours over the year. And this is something that other states do. About 14 other states have done it, and it's time for New Mexico to do it as well. And we've heard the arguments, from some folks who don't believe in this about what is the impact going to be on businesses. And the reality is that in these other states, their economies are growing. This is actually a good thing when workers are able to be productive and people can contribute to the business, and it helps everyone in the long run. So, our neighbors in Arizona and Colorado have done it, and why can't we?
Yeah. Well, we'll get a pushback, I'm sure, from especially in rural parts of the state, but I couldn't agree with you more on this. Another aspect of workers' rights is really housing, because if you can't be safely housed, it's difficult to work, right? And in Santa Fe, we've pretty much gentrified half of our workforce out of the city. What are you doing in relation to affordable housing or housing justice?
Housing is such an important area, especially for New Mexico, and especially now where you have, because of this pandemic, over 100,000 people who lost their jobs right away in March. We have a situation now where you have somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 households was the last estimate of households being at risk of eviction. And this is in New Mexico, where we've experienced already one of the highest rates of homelessness, and it's only gotten worse, and it's only going to get worse if we don't do something about it. We have some protections in place right now for people through our Supreme Court and then also federally that prevents landlords from evicting you if you cannot pay rent, and that's an important right to know. But when the emergency ends, what happens then, right? Because you have all these folks who haven't paid rent up until now, back rent that is owed. And landlords then have a right to immediately evict people, on the spot, if that rent hasn't been paid up and paid up to date. So we need some kind of relief. And what we've been advocating for, along with policymakers, there's been, a couple policymakers, Representative Angelica Rubio and Representative Andrea Romero, who've been really working on this, as well as community groups like Chainbreakers Collective, attorneys like UNM Law School, Legal Aid, and us, to get a rent relief fund in place. So a relief fund that helps people pay for rent. And we were successful, I think, in the summertime to advocate for the governor to open this up and devote at least $12 million to it. And then they came back and put another 15 million into it, but it needs a lot more. And the estimates from the Mortgage Finance Authority, the MFA, is that it's about 15 million per month that would be needed in that rent relief fund. So it's important to get more funding, into the rent relief fund and to be able to ensure that people can stay in their homes.
Yeah. Is there a specific bill that's going to be introduced in 2021 from Rubio and Romero?
There is legislation in the works.
Okay.
And looking
We
at
will
both
move that
rent
to our
relief issues
transfer. We will move that to our 15 transformational bills. That needs to be addressed. We were looking for stuff, and I had heard just the other day that Angelica and Andrea were working on that, but I didn't know much more about it. And Andrea is my representative, so she ought to be able to return the call and tell me what's going on. I know that economic equity is important at the center, and a number of bills on Retake's transformational bills addressed economic justice, including lowering rates on small predatory loans, expanding and increasing the working families tax credit. I assume you support these bills and have maybe been working on them as well.
Absolutely. We support the EITC and anything to increase minimum wage. The focus for us has been on the predatory lending bill, where we've been closely involved in that effort to work on capping interest rates and working with the groups like Native American Voters Alliance and Now Think New Mexico and consumer rights attorneys on this effort. And this is the time to do it. The interest rate before, as we all remember, I think there used to not be a cap on it, and people were taking out small loans, for that would rebound and scale up into these 1,000% interest rates on them, and extreme drain in our community. And a couple of years ago, there was legislation that brought that cap down to, or actually provided a cap that didn't exist, of 175% for interest rate, but that's still high, and it's outrageous, and it actually hasn't done what it needs to do to stop the kind of debt trap that's been happening with these predatory loans. So this year's legislation is to bring those down to 36%, which is something that other states have done. About 16 other states have a cap of 36%, and it's also something that our country does for military service folks, that any loans are at 36%. And it's important for New Mexico. Like last year alone, New Mexicans took out about 600,000 loans and paid hundreds of millions of dollars back in these loans to loan companies. And most of these companies are out of state. 90% of them are out of state. And so we're essentially, this is trapping families into debt, and then money is getting drained out of our communities and going out of state.
Right. No, it's that was one of the first issues we became involved in back in 2016. And I was just like, absolutely. It was an industry that I wasn't even really aware of. And then when you find out about it, I mean, we had many people who voted against the bill to reduce it to 175 because they were appalled that it was still going to be that high. And just today, I got an email from someone saying that on our survey, they had not supported that bill because 36% is still too high. And I'm like, well, 36% beats the hell out of 175. So I'm going to support it. It's getting quite a bit of support. You've obviously worked on issues related to poverty for a long time. Childhood education and healthcare intersect there. Do you do more advocacy? And I guess the question I'm trying to get at here is, we have a lot of agencies that or organizations that we work with that don't necessarily work outside of a silo. They've got this is what we do. How do you work in kind of spanning the silos and working across sectors? And is there any kind of coalition that's doing that in New Mexico?
Yeah, this is a good question, because we are working on these big issues, right, for our state, and working across multiple areas, whether that's healthcare, education, workers' rights issues, economic justice issues around relief and public benefits and safety net issues, childcare, for example. And I think it's, a matter of both digging deep into each of these issues and also going across the issues, right? And the way in which we handle it is really by, allowing and really ensuring that our priorities are really driven by community and by the priorities of families. And so we often link up with community organizers that are working directly in communities that are impacted and don't have access, and follow the priorities, right? And go through planning processes to figure out, okay, what are the most important things that can be done now, that should be done now, what's achievable, and then working together to get those things achieved. So we end up having these, coalitions across issue areas, like a minimum wage coalition, or the Transform Education New Mexico coalition, or this New Mexico Together for Healthcare coalition that brings together the organizers and the policy advocates and the folks who do, media work and all of those things, so that we can work together in these multi-year efforts sometimes. And then across all of that, like, what's the big picture, right? Like, and how do we coordinate across all the groups? And there are some groups that are doing that, including Center for Civic Policy, that has its, nonprofit C3 table for groups that are like-minded to come around these issues, and groups that are working on economic justice and racial justice in particular. So it's good to have those kinds of forums and abilities to be able to look across, different issue areas too, and to be able to connect with folks that you might not normally connect with.
Well, and you were just kind of segueing over to the next question, which is taking a look at the bigger picture. And one of the perspectives Retake has long, and this is the last question, has long written about, is that the systems that have gotten us here, whether it's colonialism and capitalism, systemic racism, are not going to be the systems that fix things. And so our perspective has been that we need to kind of invent a new path, invent new systems, transformative systems. So I like to ask our guests, what would such a transformed system look like to you?
We truly, and I said this at the beginning, we truly live in a wonderful community in New Mexico. It's truly an amazing community, a vibrant community, and yet dealing with the kinds of inequities that we deal with, and you named it, colonization, systemic racism, really should have no place in our society, and yet they infiltrate, all of our systems and how we operate, laws, policies, culturally. So it's critical, I think, for us to keep working on those things that are most important to the well-being of our families, like we've been and continue to do, like our public education system, or having the basics like food and housing and healthcare. Everybody deserves this. These are basic human rights. Your rights as a worker to have good jobs, to be in safe working conditions, and then the ability to have financial security, to be able to build assets, to not be trapped in debt, to have opportunities so that you can be and do the things that you want to do. So it's critical to advance those bold policies. We support that and agree. Now is the time, right, to advance those bold policies for economic justice, because we all want to see the New Mexico that we're dreaming of, right? And we all want to see it be the best, and in a place where we want to raise our kids, and where working people have good jobs, where everybody who's in our community is really part of our community. And the last year has been so challenging, and that can't be understated, just how challenging the year has been. But it's also really reflected that people are stepping up, in ways for each other, and people are doing things for each other, including, the simple act of voting, or getting these housing relief funds together, or food distribution programs together. And it shows us that even though we face these really big issues, they're not intractable and they're not unsolvable. We have the ability to turn things around, and we have the ability to do that here in New Mexico. And if we don't do that, we're going to see what we owe, which is the special interests will continue to dictate everything, right, in the state. It's going to be the oil and gas industry, or the predatory lenders, or the big pharmacy, or the out-of-state hospitals that are going to define, what all of these systems look like for us.
Right.
So I think our best bet is to organize, to keep doing it, trust ourselves to keep fighting this. I hope that our governor and our policymakers join us, that we can do this together and make it happen.
Yeah, well, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. If someone wanted to find out more information about your work, how could they do that, Sireesh?
We are online, so come to our website. It's at www.nmpovertylaw.org. So New Mexico povertylaw.org, nmpovertylaw.org. And we also are on social media, so you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel now, so visit us online.
We have one too. We were trying to expand our Facebook presence, and I made a post about it and got so much pushback with people saying, get off of Facebook, just turn it off and turn off your site. And it was like, oh, well, so much for that idea. I just want to close by thanking you very much, Sireesh. This has been a great conversation. And I also want to close by acknowledging that today is the last show of 2020. All I can say is that on New Year's Eve, Roxanne and I plan to take our 2020 calendar and burn it in the fireplace and reduce it to ashes. It's been a brutal year, absolutely brutal, and on so many levels. May 2021 be a year that brings us health, some level of mature leadership in Washington, and a restoration of some semblance of normal to our lives. But I think we really have to be cautious about this extreme desire for a return to normalcy, because normal wasn't very good for us well before COVID. And so we're going to have to raise our sights a bit higher than the status quo, or we're going to land back in another year like 2020. So as I always do when I end the show, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay active, stay safe, stay healthy, but stay active, because that's the only way we're going to fix this mess. See you next year. Thank you. I got to stop the recording there. Okay. And, I was going to also mention to you, Sireesh, that, God, I almost lost it there. Talking about 2020.
It's been a bad year. Yeah. Cannot wait.
Yeah. I just also wanted to thank you. I know that Rich and Terry Storch are kind of they sent me the draft of the work they've done on tax policy. And I know that they had mentioned that one of their friends, Sireesh, was going to take a look at it at some point. And I didn't know who that was at all until, I started organizing this session. And so it's funny how things interconnect. And then Lindsay and I were going to talk today at 1 when this had to get moved over to 1. So Lindsay's someone I've actually met a few times. I've sat next to at the Roundhouse many times. I'm guessing you've been there as well, but I hadn't met you before. So it was a pleasure meeting you. And
yeah, likewise.
Appreciate your time and your work.
Rich actually was working at Legal Aid when I was in law school, and so I had the opportunity to work with him during one summer, and so we go back. But yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to them again, and it has been a pleasure to meet you as well. And I'm sure we will see each other at the legislature. Maybe not this year if it's all virtual, but future time at least.
Yeah, I think it's going to be virtual this year, but and I hear Ivy Soto's trying to get pushed back because of COVID. He just says it's irresponsible, and I actually agree with him. So thanks a lot, and hopefully we'll get this legislature to move forward with the funds it needs to advance. Had you actually read the Voices thing yet? They-
I have seen a version of it, and because we've worked with voices on so many
Right,
things,
right.
I think I've probably seen pieces of it before, but I had not seen what was issued, what was released yesterday, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I was, it's 5:30. I'm sitting there with a glass of wine and I'm blown away. It's so good. So
Nice.
highly recommended. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Thank you.
On to Lindsay.
Right. Yeah, and I hope that the radio show came out okay.
Oh, it was
Early,
great.
because,
That was a great
yeah,
show.
very focused on
And
education. I know you wanted to talk about the bigger, legislative agenda as well. So,
more people, I think, listen to it on the podcast than on the radio show.
okay.
So we'll get you a link too. Okay, thank you very much, Sireesh.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Bye.